Now, I'm not sure if this is going to work. I had hoped to have a video tonight, but if it's not, I can tell you all about what's in it. So, well, first of all, welcome everyone, and so my name is Matthew James Gray. So, as well as being a lecturer here, I'm also doing my PhD at Adelaide Uni in history. That's in the early modern period, so I'll be honest, I'm not a PhD academic in early church period, but I have lectured in this several times, and have been looked at this kind of stuff a fair bit. One of the things that you find when you're doing apologetics is there are times where there are really good arguments and like things that, you know, are real sticking points and ones that, you hope no one asks and that kind of stuff. You know those ones? Like, if you're an atheist and you're here tonight, you've got some absolutely fantastic things that you could fire at me and I'd be going, that's a tough one. Ooh. This is not one of them. Okay, I just want to put that out to you from the beginning. Let me do you a favour, atheist. There are any number of really great arguments. Using the Library of Alexandria as something, I think you can do better. I'll just put that right out there at the beginning. But that doesn't mean that some darn good people haven't given it a right good try. And they're pretty impressive people. So one of them is Edward Gibbon. Now, who's ever heard of Edward Gibbon? Right, so Edward Gibbon famously wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And two things about that one. First, he was pretty darn sure that there was one cause for the fall of the Roman Empire, and that was Christianity. And so this was one of the arguments that he used around the Library of Alexandria. And second of all, he was part of the English Empire, the British Empire, during its high point of colonialism in the 19th century. And so his basic argument was, see what those flipping Christians did to the Roman Empire, they ruined it, they're going to do the same to us. And he was the first person to really make this a popular argument against Christianity. Next...
all the colonies, didn't we?
Pardon?
We lost all the colonies.
Yeah, like it's all we say. The next person to do it was this guy, Carl Sagan.
Let me tell you about the end.
He's talking about what happened at the end of the Alexandrian library. This goes for around about 4 or so minutes, but it's flipping Carl Sagan, and like, he's so eloquent and he's just so awesome that you might as well hear it really well put by a really awesome atheist. So here we go.
It's a story about the last scientist to work in this place, a mathematician, astronomer, physicist, and head of the school of Neoplatonic philosophy in Alexandria. That's an extraordinary range of accomplishments for any individual in any age. Her name was Hypatia. She was born in this city in the year 370 AD. This was a time when women had essentially no options. They were considered property. Nevertheless, Hypatia was able to move freely, unselfconsciously, through traditional male domains. By all accounts, she was a great beauty. And although she had many suitors, she had no interest in marriage. The Alexandria of Hypatia's time, by then long under Roman rule, was a city in grave conflict. Slavery, the cancer of the ancient world, had sapped classical civilization of its vitality. The growing Christian church was consolidating its power and attempting to eradicate pagan influence and culture. Hypatia stood at the focus, at the epicenter of mighty social forces. Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, despised her. in part because of her close friendship with a Roman governor, but also because she was symbolized. She was a symbol of learning and science, which were largely identified by the early church with paganism. In great personal danger, Hypatia continued to teach and to publish until, in the year 415 AD, on her way to work, she was set upon by a fanatical mob of Cyril's followers. They dragged her from a chariot, tore off her clothes, and flayed her flesh from her bones with abalone shells. Her remains were burned, her works obliterated, her name forgotten. Cyril was made a saint. The glory you see around me is nothing but a memory. It does not exist. The last remains of the library were destroyed within a year of Hypatia's death. It's as if an entire civilization had undergone a sort of self-inflicted radical brain surgery, so that most of its memories, discoveries, ideas, and passions were irrevocably wiped out. The loss was incalculable. In some cases, we know only the tantalizing titles of books that had been destroyed. In most cases, we know neither the titles nor the authors. We do know that in this library, there were 123 different plays by Sophocles, of which only 7 have survived to our time. One of those 7 is Oedipus Rex. Similar numbers apply to the lost works of Aeschylus, Euripides, Aristophanes. It's a little as if the only surviving works of a man named William Shakespeare were Coriolanus and A Winter's Tale, although we had heard that he had written some other things which were highly prized in his time. Plays called Hamlet, Macbeth, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Romeo and Juliet. History is full of people who, out of fear or ignorance or the lust for power, have destroyed treasures of immeasurable value, which truly belong to all of us. We must not let it happen again.
Wow. Sounds really bad. Right? It like it does. I find particularly the moment where he says that, particularly his portrayal of Cyril in there, and particularly the subtle implication of Cyril's followers do this horrible thing to Hypatia, and then he's made a saint. And you might have picked up there's a little bit of a causal implication there, as if the church went, great job on slaughtering that horrible pagan academic, now we'll saint you because of that. Right? And what do you do with that? Like that's pretty intimidating. This has also been famously made into a movie with Rachel Weisz by a guy called Alejandro Amenabar called Agora. So Weisz plays Hypatia, and it's very heavily based on the Gibbon-Sagan interpretation of what happened. Has anyone seen Agora? Right, it's not an easy, like it's pretty rough. It's pretty violent at certain points. The thing is that when you actually look at each facet of it, it breaks down awfully quickly. So, first of all, let's talk about the library. The portrayal of the library, as shown by Sagan and also in Agora, is what I would call chronologically elastic. What I mean by that is the library was the largest of its kind in antiquity, like just massive, huge, astonishing large collection. And yes, a mob of Christians did burn it in 415 AD. There's just one problem. There's about 400 years between it being the largest library of all time and then burning it. See, what happened was that around about 40 BC, before there's even Christianity at all, while Julius Caesar was there, with Julius Caesar, Cleopatra and all that bunch, it was burned there. That was by far the most significant burning, and it just obliterated the place. It was devastating. That had nothing to do with Christians. It's really hard to blame Christians for things in BC. Okay? Like, you can give it a right good shot, but, you know, it's going to be a bit tricky. So, as well as that, there was subsequently quite a lot of other subsequent burnings, because even though the library was burned, people continued to try to, you know, prop up its library, keep on providing more books, and of course had to keep on copying out books. And as well as that, the process of academic, you know, study and things like that that were aligned with the library in what we might call an academy, although it's a bit more complicated than just saying it was a university or academy. But that teaching centre continued to stay there, and students need books. So the library was still being maintained throughout that point. But to plant all of the works of like these amazing people, Sagan's making a bit of a leap there, right? It's rather unfair to blame us as if when we, you know, burnt an office, which is effectively how it ends up being, that's the same as us destroying the largest library of all time, right? That doesn't make it right that the Christians did do that when they did in 415, but it does stop us from, you know, perhaps dulls the claim that the entirety of ancient literature was destroyed by them.
Did they actually burn the library or the Serapeum?
Well, we'll get to that. Right. Secondly, actually, no, I'll talk about that now. So, technically, the library had been burnt down for years, like in terms of the big building. What they burnt down was a smaller building called the Serapeum, and the Serapeum was linked to a temple. Now, I'll explain why that's significant a little later, but it was linked to a pagan temple that was in the city at the time, and they had started to use that as a storage space for the library. Secondly, the portrayal of the academy, Alexandria's academy, is grossly one-dimensional. To suggest that the Alexandrian academy was some kind of haven of pagan learning amidst a sea of, you know, Christian superstition, which is kind of what he portrays there, is just ridiculous. Because by that point, Christianity had been an, if not the, essential supporter for the academy for over 200 years. Right? So it's not a pagan institution. It's an institution effectively run, financed, benefiting from Christians. And furthermore, those Christians had no problem having her on staff. Okay? If it had Christian scholars involved there since Clement of Alexandria in 100 AD. In the early 200s, he was replaced by a guy called Origen, O-R-I-G-E-N. Some people say Origin, but that's because they don't know Greek. Who tutored at the academy from the time he was 17. Origen's a very, very clever cookie. And Origen loved his writing. Origen is the first person that I've ever heard of who did multi-tabbing writing. And what I mean by that is he actually usually had about 6 to 10 people around him, and he would write to this one about this book, and then he'd be like, okay, write down, that reminds me, I want you to write down this now, blah, 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 blah. I need, so he's writing 10 books at once, right? Now, there's a lot more to say about Origen, and I'll say a little bit more later, but I'm talking about the early 200s, which is when the Roman Empire and Alexandria was still actually run by pagans. So, like, there's an example of Alexandrian scholarship having authentic Christians involved, and them not running the show at all. So it's a bit, all of this kind of starts to get a bit odd. There's a lot more to say about Origen, and I'll say more soon, but my point is, he represents one of the greatest academics that the Alexandrian Academy ever produced. And he was also one of the most influential Christian theologians of his day, with many of his approaches to theology still having influence upon Eastern Orthodoxy even today. To suggest for 1 second that Christians weren't an integral part of the academy is patently ridiculous. They were some of the most important contributors to it. And furthermore, a vast collection of the books that ended up being burnt in the Serapeon were either authored by Christians or were pagan works that had been recopied by Christians, because that's what we did. So, right. Now, let's talk about Hypatia. Okay, the portrayal of Hypatia is also incredibly selective and anachronistic. Anachronistic is when you portray a historical figure in such a way that they look just like you in your time now. Right? Ana means not, chronos, time. You know, what you're doing is you're applying your ethics and values onto a person who had completely different cultural ethics and values because they're from a completely different historical culture. And Carl Sagan is an amazing scholar and an amazing physicist, but as an historian, he is amazingly anachronistic here. Okay? Hypatia, did you notice that he called her a Neoplatonist and then didn't tell you what that meant? That's actually kind of a big deal when you're talking about Hypatia, right? To try to suggest that a Neoplatonic philosopher like Hypatia is pretty much the same as a secular atheist materialist like Carl Sagan is just wow weird. Like, it's just way off base. Because here's the thing, Neoplatonism was highly religious. When we think of the word philosophy, we often divorce it from theology. But that's a remarkably recent thing. When you talked about philosophy in the ancient world, it was frequently, almost entirely, having some basis of religious aspects to it as well. And Neoplatonism was a remarkably monotheistic religion. Okay? Like, that's the word we use for it. So this is actually a diagram that I show my students in my church history course here. This is Neoplatonism in a diagram. So let me explain. So at the top, you've got the One. And the One is God. And what that God, the One is, he's fully complete. He's the teleos, he's complete, whole, perfect. And he's also photos, he's light, he's goodness, he's also pneumata, he's spirit. So he represents light, spirit, good. And what he does is like the sun, he radiates out his goodness. Now, from that point, you get spiritual beings that are pretty impressive, but they're not the One. But they're spirit, so they're good. The best of those is right next to the One, and his name is the Logos, or the Word, or sometimes wisdom, or nous, mind, those kind of things. Now, what happens is that the light of the One permeates out, and the darker it gets, the darkness is a representation of materiality, of the material world. So the world is evil, and the whole reason it's evil is because it's material. So the goal of a Neoplatonist was to use the mind and the understanding of mathematics, specifically in terms of mathematical equations around the cosmos and things like that, almost in an astrological sense, in a semi-religious sense, to therefore use the logos, the mind, to break from the physical and to enter into the spiritual and to become unioned with the one. How are we doing so far? You with me? Okay. Now there's a lot more to Neoplatonism, but that'll help. As such, Neoplatonic philosophy tends towards elevating the spiritual, the ethereal, the abstract, and de-emphasizes the material world or cosmos. Do you understand? Right? In many ways, Neoplatonism, actually, when you look at it, you can see why it looks actually more like Christianity than it does like secular atheism. It's got a God who's a monotheistic God. You've got this kind of God that isn't, this is where it gets a bit messy for us Christian theologians, the Logos, there's a little bit going on there. I don't know. You know, the world is evil. Sometimes we think like that. I have no idea. And one thing I can definitely say is that does not look like secular atheism at all. That doesn't look like Carl Sagan's fanboy. Right? Three more things about Neoplatonism that are relevant here. Firstly, given its elevation on the spiritual, of the spiritual and the disdain for the material, Sagan's attempts to align Neoplatonism somehow with modern secularism is just absurd. And to be fair, Agora actually goes to a whole new level of absurdity in that. Modern secularism actually, and especially Satanism, is the exact opposite of Neoplatonism, right? It elevates the material, right, and has a complete disdain for the spiritual. It's the exact opposite. Polemics make strange bedfellows, it seems, right? The questions around why Hypatia was so interested in the material sciences, given this anti-material aspect to a religious belief system, they're a really intriguing mystery that I don't have time to talk about tonight. But I can say she herself would be horrified to be aligned with Sagan's materialism. It is entirely antithetical to everything that she religiously believes. Historically, she was far, far more noted for her contribution to philosophy than anything to do with astronomy or the sciences generally. Don't get me wrong, she did do some great scientific stuff. Her dad was a mathematician and she contributed to mathematical understandings at the time. But primarily her approach to mathematics was driven by her religion, not by a materialist philosophy. Two scholars who have examined her approach to mathematics and science at the time, Dr. James Killings and Dr. Richard Carter, would find the kind of portrayal of Hypatia as some modern empirical scientist just way off base. Secondly, let's talk about the origins of Neoplatonism. Where did it come up with? Where and when did it come from and who by? Well, actually Neoplatonism is identified as a development of Plato's thought from around about 200 AD from, guess where? Alexandria and the Alexandrian Academy. It was formulated by two academics from the academy, both students of the great second century professor Ammonius Saccas. Those two academics were a guy called Plotinus, a pagan philosopher, and another guy you may have heard of because I talked about him earlier, Origen. So, Origen created a Christian Neoplatonism in Alexandria at the academy while reading and writing a heck of a lot of books about that. In fact, he dedicated his entire career and reputation to seeking to merge Neoplatonism and Christianity. Now, how effectively he did that is a fun thing that theologians still argue about. But my point is, right, to suggest that Neoplatonism, even a more pagan, like Plotinus's kind of pagan Neoplatonism, is, you know, somewhere greatly at odds with Christianity, and that Christians, it's just not historically accurate. Okay? The renowned patristic scholar Dr. Edward Moore cites Plotinus's protege Porphyry, and Porphyry hated Christianity, hated it. But even he begrudgingly admitted that when it came to Neoplatonic philosophy and an understanding of pagan philosophy generally, Origen was the master. A master of philosophy. And you know why? Because he saw no threat in pagan philosophy whatsoever. Right? Origen was an Alexandrian Christian academic who had absolutely no problem whatsoever with pagan philosophy. And to be honest, he stands in a long and illustrious line of further Christian thinkers who passionately integrated pagan philosophy into his theology. So as if they're running around in Alexandria, like the academy is this pagan place of solace, and all the Christians are running around outside of it saying, don't like that. It just isn't what's happening. Right? The Christians are in the academy. They're running it. And they're having no problem having nice, fun, theoretical conversations about abstract philosophy and theology with the pagan ones, including Hypatia. Now, having said that, it is true that there was opposition to Neoplatonism among Christians, especially by the time of Cyril of Alexandria. Got to put that out. Despite Origen's incredible influence over Christianity and Christian thought throughout the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries, by the 6th century his influence was waning, and by the 6th century, which is even further along the journey, he was condemned as a heretic by the church at the 6th Ecumenical Council in 681, which is actually the 7th century, sorry. There are several reasons for that, most notably about universalism. But even then, Origen's universalism is intrinsically tied up in his Neoplatonic influences on Christianity, on his Christianity. It's precisely because he's a Neoplatonist and he's kind of pushed that onto Christianity that ultimately sees him go and get into trouble. So my point is, yeah, Christianity did have a problem with Neoplatonism, and that got to a head probably over 200 years after the whole thing with Hypatia, but it still happened. And here's why. The reason is because Christians grew wary of how Neoplatonism showed disdain for the material world, as if it was something that didn't matter. That matter didn't matter. Christians didn't like that. And the reason Christians didn't like that was because biblically, the material world isn't evil. Biblically, the material world is a thing broken by sin, yes, but it's a good thing. It reveals who God is. It was designed by a good God, not as some kind of emanation where all of the good stuff had gone away. No, he purposely made it, and he made it good. And yes, it's stuffed in some ways, but that doesn't stop it from still having the thumbprint of God on it. And so therefore, if we study the material world, that's a good thing to do because it'll help us to understand God better. He made it to do so. Right? Christians disagreed with Neoplatonism because Neoplatonism was starting to make everyone think that the material world was unimportant and didn't matter and you shouldn't look at it. In other words, Neoplatonism was discouraging the pursuit of science, and Christians didn't like that. They felt that it, to quote Romans 1, reveals something of God's character and divine nature. They thus saw the material world as a good thing worthy of study, and they saw that Neoplatonism's criticism of the material discouraged it. What that means is, it was in its distancing itself from the ethereal Neoplatonic philosophy represented by Hypatia that Christianity was able to save Western thought from completely abandoning the pursuit of science. Christianity said, then and now, God made all this stuff and he wants us to learn how he did it. This makes Sagan and Agora's portrayal of Christianity as anti-science laughable. In the film, Hypatia is killed by the mob just as she's discovering heliocentrism. So just as she discovers the sun, the earth revolves around the sun, we've got it all wrong. What were we thinking? I should go tell everyone that. Oh no, I'm being killed by a mob. Right? And the implication, as you get from the clip that I showed you from Sagan, is that and Sagan wrote about this much more scathingly than in the video that I showed you. Sagan accused Christianity of holding humanity back by 1400 years, basically implying that if we had just let pagans keep on doing what they did without getting in their way and stifling science, we'd be sending people rocketing into the moon by 900 AD. That kind of an implication. There's just one little problem. There is no evidence anywhere that Hypatia even gave a two cahoots about heliocentrism, let alone, there's no evidence that she even read anything about heliocentrism, and there's no evidence that she came up with that idea at all. But more than that, right? But more than that, it's just the sense of, well, it could have happened, so that's enough history for me. Really? Now, I will say it is absolutely true that Christians did support for a long, long time a lot of wrong science. I just want to put that out there. I want to admit that straight away. We did support a terracentric view of the universe, for example.
That was Aristotelian.
Wait, don't steal my thunder, man. Right? But we did support things like a terracentric view of the universe. We supported things like the idea of four elements, earth, air, fire and water, and how that affects your phlegm and your mucus and all kinds of disgusting stuff. We did all of that. Just want to freely admit that. And you know why we did that? Because the best scientists of the day told us to. We did it because we derived that stuff not from our Christianity. Christianity doesn't tell us that there's four elements. Christianity doesn't tell us that the earth, that the sun revolves around the earth. No, right? We derive that from Greek pagan academics, such as Aristotle, Ptolemy, for example. Now, those guys have got it wrong, but when we defended those claims, it wasn't Christian dogmatism, right? It was actually because we were just saying they're the scientists, they know what they're talking about. Now, don't get me wrong, we sometimes sprinkled a nice bit of Christian veneer over the top of that to say, yeah, God likes it too. I'm not denying that for a second. But fundamentally, Christian scientists defended those ideas back then the same way that scientists today defend things like the periodic table, right? All you're doing when you defend the periodic table is defending the prevailing scientific dogma of the day. Now, don't get me, please don't say Matt's questioning the periodic table. That's not my point. Imagine if someone came out and said, you know what, periodic table's a load of bunk. And now, let's get that one out. Imagine how much of a scientific poo storm it would take for everyone to go, yeah, okay, seems legit. It would take years of arguing about that. Now imagine that the church comes in and says, yeah, if they say that the periodic table's wrong, all you scientists are idiots and we know better. How would people react to that? They'd punch us in the face. They'd tell us we were being ridiculous. Stay out of it. You don't know what you're doing. Well, when everyone tells you that the earth is in the centre and the best scientists tell you that the sun goes around, the church said it's not our place to question the science that we've been taught. That's until you can give us enough evidence, and it'll probably take you a couple of hundred years, I've got to tell you, we're going to back up the scientists. So again, accusing Christianity of holding this back is just chronologically ridiculous. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong, right? Christians did do the wrong thing by supporting those things, but they didn't do it because their Christianity is anti-science. They did it because the poor science was inherited from paganism in the first place. Moving on, let's talk about this chestnut. This is Cyril of Alexandria, and he's bad. Did you know? You might have picked that up from Sagan, and in the movie, he's really, really, really bad. Okay? Now, I've got to say, I don't like him. I'm just going to put that right out there from the beginning. Okay? Let me say from the outset, I have no problem saying that Cyril of Alexandria was, for the most part, and I want to use the correct academic term, a dead set tool. I have no problem saying that. He was a douchebag of epic proportions. He was stubborn, he was dogmatic, he was political, he was cantankerous, he was grumpy. He was just not a great guy. I've read some of Cyril's works, right? And I can honestly say, though, for all of his faults, there is no way, like you can accuse Cyril of countless things. Being anti-intellectual is not one of them. Okay? This is the last thing you could accuse Cyril of. Let me tell you the reason I know that Cyril is stubborn and grumpy. Because it's also the reason he was canonized as a saint by the church. Cyril passionately defended his view of the balance between Jesus Christ's humanity and divinity, especially against another scholar of the time, a guy called Nestorius of Antioch. Now, okay, if you're not a Christian, I apologise, because I've got to explain some kind of Christian in-house housekeeping for a minute that you probably don't care about, but just work with me here. Be patient. Okay. For any non-Christians there, what I'm going to do is talk about this. So, okay. Given the Alexandrian penchant that we've already described of elevating the spiritual, because of the Neoplatonism, the influence of that, they tended, when it came to looking at Jesus is, and this is kind of at the end of the story, fully God and fully human. All right? He is divine and human. Just work with us if you're not a Christian. Just bear with me. In this argument, this is where Christians end up. Because of the Neoplatonism and the emphasis of the spiritual, the Alexandrians adamantly emphasised the divinity of Christ to de-emphasise the humanity. You with me so far? Antioch, which was down the road and really didn't like Alexandria because they were vying for government funds, they elevated the humanity of Jesus at the expense of his spiritual divine nature. Now, to be honest, at the beginning of the argument between the Alexandrian Cyril and the Antiochian Nestorius, it's probably more like, 55-45. That kind of a thing, between one or the other. It's a little bit of an emphasis one way or the other. But you know how when you get two people who are just really cantankerous and really grumpy and really antagonistic with each other, the more they argue, the more they set themselves in their own position and the more they portray the other person by the extreme of their position and just dig their heels in. That's exactly what happened with Cyril and Nestorius. Eventually, the Alexandrians, backing up Cyril, became very strong in their emphasising of Christ's divinity at the expense of his humanity. And that tipped over into a horrible thing called monophysitism. Doesn't matter for now, but you can look it up later. Now, my point is, right, consequently, Cyril insisted that Nestorius was, and I quote, so stupid and misguided as to think Jesus had rescinded much of his divinity to kind of effectively squeeze into a human body. So, right, he accused Nestorius of saying that Jesus had thrown away his divinity, basically become a human being with a little bit of, divinity still managed to squeeze into the corner, right? Which is a gross misrepresentation of Nestorius' position. I'm not a Nestorius fanboy either. I think they were both being jerks. But, right, ultimately, the two of them argued so much about this that the church held its most embarrassing ecumenical council. The third one, Ephesus. Have you ever noticed no one ever talks about Ephesus? Everyone talks about Nicaea. Awesome. Constantinople fixes anything that wasn't awesome about Nicaea. Then something happened. Then we had Chalcedon, and that was awesome. Right? The one in between there that no one talks about is Ephesus. And that's because that's all about Nestorius and Cyril arguing with each other. And that is a fascinating story for another day. But my point here is to say that Cyril ended up coming out of that, right, having his position vindicated, at least temporarily. Nestorius condemned as a heretic, and as soon as that happened, everything was looking down the line for Cyril to get sainthood, okay, which he got posthumously when he died. So my point there is, firstly, Cyril gets it because of his contribution to theological doctrine. And secondly, I'd add, I don't like Cyril very much. So my point here is twofold. Firstly, I want you to understand I am certainly not a fan of Cyril, and if he did something wrong, I am the last person who's going to defend him. But secondly, you don't have the kind of highly complex philosophical arguments about the nature of divinity and humanity and all of that kind of stuff, and write in the incredibly complex and sophisticated way that Cyril does when he's arguing with Nestorius, if you don't care about academia, pagan philosophy, and learning generally. Okay? The whole reason that Cyril is so combative is because he's a passionate academic, not an anti-intellectual. Cyril did not fall into conflict with Hypatia or anybody else because he hated learning. There are other issues, primarily around the politics of the time, and especially his fiery relationship with the governor of Alexandria, Orestes, who was a friend of Hypatia's. A contemporary from the time, Socrates of Constantinople, reported the incident where Hypatia was killed, speaking very highly of Hypatia as having such learning that, quote, all men on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue admired her the more. All men did. Christian and non-Christian. Socrates, I want to point out, is a priest and a church historian. He's a passionate Christian, and he's saying that about Hypatia. Okay? He explained that she was killed once, quote, she fell victim to the political jealousy which at that time prevailed. For as she had previous interviews with Orestes, it was calumniously reported among the Christian populace that it was she who prevented Orestes from being reconciled to the bishop. Right. Contrary to the way it is portrayed in the movie, this has nothing to do with Cyril wanting her to become Christian. It had everything to do with her involvement with Orestes and him not liking Orestes very much. Now, that doesn't make it right. But it does stop it being about him being a religious zealot squashing pagan learning. And yes, Cyril's supporters in Alexandria did kill Hypatia. No doubt. And yes, they did attack the library. And yes, it was very, very, very wrong of them to do so. But it's worth recognising that Cyril's supporters only did so upon the serious provocation of pagans, who had then retreated into the Serapeon, into this temple, which alongside housed the last of the library, while also being a pagan temple. Eventually, they were forced to surrender, and then the Christians came in and burned the last vestiges of the library and the entire temple itself, basically as an act of vengeance upon the pagans who had been so mean to them in the first place. Does that make it right? Does that make it Christian? Absolutely not. But it does explain it a little bit more. And to align Hypatia with all of that, it's a little bit 2 plus 2 equals 5. What they're doing is they're saying, well, it was a pagan temple, she was a pagan, same diff, except it's a pagan to pagan gods. She's a Neoplatonist. In the movie, she's running around in there going, don't hurt, take the books out, and guys, get away, I'm on your side. That's not what was happening at all. It's like saying, oh, well, Muslim and Jews, they're monotheistic, so it's the same diff. Like, no, like, they're very different religions. Okay? And the process of academic study by that time was far removed geographically and admittedly, from the scraps of the old library that was still in the Serapeum. Still, it was, and I want to reiterate this, very, very wrong of them to kill Hypatia and damage the library. And many Christians at the time openly would agree that it was wrong for them to do that because they told them it was wrong to do that. Right? These people were not indicative of classical Christianity. They were told off for this by classical Christianity. Again, Socrates of Constantinople, who I read earlier, continued, "This affair brought not the least criticism and disgrace, not only upon Cyril, but also upon the whole Alexandrian church. And surely nothing can be farther from the spirit of Christianity than the allowance of massacres, fights, and transactions of that sort." Christianity did not celebrate these events. It did not award Cyril and his supporters for their involvement in these events, however much he was directly involved in them himself, which is debated in itself. He did not get awarded a sainthood for this event. He got told off for it by the rest of the Christian world because Christians didn't think it was okay. All right? Sagan's implication that Cyril was awarded sainthood for killing Hypatia and burning the library is highly embellished. Now, looking beyond the mechanics of what actually happened during this incident, the question I come to is, why would anyone care about it? Well, the reason this is often brought up by atheists like Sagan and explained the way it is and portrayed the way it is because it just fits so nicely with their Enlightenment, modernist, secularist scientism narrative, with their view of history. Sagan explicitly argued that we had moved into a new era and advocated for scientific analysis of the material world to be the exclusive measure of reality, and for that to be the way that this era is ruled. Central to this was the idea that all previous approaches, particularly Christian, which he identified with superstition, were terrible and had stopped our development of anything good. And you see that right at the end of that clip. Okay. They were only there to stop our development as a species, to stop our pursuit of the truth. His approach insists that atheists bring education and learning, and religions, and specifically Christianity, stop education and learning from happening. So he, and those who agree with him, go searching for any historical event that supports that narrative. And if you wangle with the details enough, Hypatia and the Alexandrian library thing, do that for you, right? Then you can make it look like Christians are anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-literature generally. Now, I've shown you just how much wangling you have to do, but heck, you can make a really cool movie out of it. There's just one problem. That whole narrative, more broadly speaking, is historically untenable. Even if you could somehow argue that all that atheists say and what Sagan says is exactly what happened in Alexandria in the 5th century, right? And you can't do that without embellishing the facts pretty badly. You have to ignore the entirety of European history during and after that. Like, let me concede. You know what? Have the Alexandrian library. Have Hypatia. Make her your... That's fine. I'll concede that. I really shouldn't, but I will. What the hey? Even if I did that, what about the 1400 years after Hypatia, during the Hypatian period, right up until like today? Okay? Because here's the thing, Christians have consistently been the key instigators in preserving literature, not destroying it. They have been the biggest encouragers of learning in academia, not the suppressors of it. They have been the highest supporters of the greatest pagan thinkers, especially in philosophy, such as Aristotle and Plato, and in science, such as Ptolemy, even when it was actually naughty of us to do so, right? And they have been at the forefront of scientific discovery since Copernicus, Newton, and that big fella, Reverend George Lemaitre, who is a renowned physicist and Catholic priest who came up with a really great theory, you might have heard of it, called the Big Bang. right? He's a reverend. He's a Catholic priest. Christians have always had no problem with scientific discovery. Let me briefly give you a few other examples of what I mean. Let's talk about the accusation that we destroy literature. Do you know why? Like, he talks about all of these wonderful books that are gone. Do you know why we have Oedipus Rex? Do you know why we have any of those books? Well, I'll tell you, the books that have actually somehow managed to make it through, right? That's not an easy thing to do, right? Preserving books, these books are made of organic materials, right? They are therefore susceptible to degradation at the hands of damp, fire, rot, parasites, bookworm, those kind of things, right? In the approximately, I worked it out, 500,000 days since the Alexandrian library and now, it's a bit more than that, but there's been about 500,000 days between now and then. It takes one day in a book's life for it to go. One day where there's a fire. One day where someone lets the water run through. Right? One day where that happens. So who has protected those books throughout the time since 450 AD all the way up to here? Who's done that? Who dedicated their time to making new copies when previous ones began to degrade? Who saw to it that books were propagated so that if one did get damaged in somewhere else, there were 5 other copies everywhere else? Who did that? Christian monks and nuns, that's who, and nobody else. From extremely early on, probably long before Hypatia, and right until the arrival of the printing press, the only people looking after books were Christian monastics. Monks and nuns, such as the Benedictines, for example, had within their rules, their manuals for living, time every day set aside to the reading and copying of books. They highly valued reading. This is from the Antiochian rule. The remedy for sloth is spiritual joy and the comfort of joyful hope, which comes from reading. Often, dear sisters, you ought to say fewer fixed prayers so that you may do more reading. Reading is good prayer. Reading teaches us how to pray and what to pray for, and then prayer achieves it. In the course of reading, when the heart is pleased, that arises a spirit of devotion which is worth many prayers. And again, I want to stress, when they're writing that, they're not just talking about religious works. They're talking about pagan philosophy and the arts and the sciences. And that's because God made it. He wants us to know more about it. So, the claim that Christians didn't care about literature and deliberately sought to obliterate it just omits over a millennia of us protecting books. And let me tell you, it's not an easy or a cheap thing to do. Paper wasn't invented. Instead, the common materials for long-term writing were parchment, usually made of sheepskin, or vellum, which is usually made from calfskin. Obviously, that's an animal. And you have to let that animal grow up. You have to feed it. You have to rear it. You have to maintain it, and then you have to kill it and all that kind of thing. That made it just expensive from the very beginning of making a book. Right? Add to that that the leather had a myriad of uses, all of which, using it as a writing of implement, basically using it as paper, you had to compete with that. Someone said, I want to use it for a saddle, I want to use it for this, and I'll pay money to turn it into a saddle. And someone said, I'll pay more to turn it into paper. So, think, who has a leather couch? Right? It cost a bit, I'm taking a guess. I've got a leather couch. It cost a lot. That's because leather costs a bit. Now try making books out of the stuff, right? Once the leather was procured, it was tanned in a lime solution, then washed in water, then stretched onto a frame where sometimes it would break, which would mean there were less materials. Then it was scraped with a lunarium, that circular knife. You see that guy holding there? Then it was dried again, then wet again. Then it was pounced, which means it's kind of rubbed with pumice. Then it was wet again, then it was pounced again. Finally, it was given a fine pounce of chalk to make it white and ready to take ink. Think of the hours in a pre-industrial age that it takes to even get that. And someone's willing to do that for the sake of books. And they're Christians. Now, think of how, when you get home, pull a book off your bookshelf, sit down and write 2 pages out. Now multiply that by the thousands of pieces of paper that you would have to do and the hours that you would have to take. Time yourself. That's how much time these people invested into learning. And I don't even have time to tell you, after all of that, you get the rise of the universities. Christians made universities. The greatest minds and the great preservers of philosophical systems were Christians who invented the university system, and not just for theology. They used it for science, medicine, and countless other things. Right? You know, the whole perception that we were against pagan philosophy. The key defender of pagan philosophy during the medieval period was Thomas Aquinas, who adamantly supported Aristotelianism. So, like, you know, I don't have time to go through all of that. I don't have time to tell you about Anselm of Canterbury, Bonaventura, William of Ockham, Peter Lombard, Duns Scotus. I don't have time to tell you about the American education system and how we were at the forefront of the Ivy League. You know, universities like Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all of those, they were started by Christians. How do you think it makes Christians, how do you think it would make those monks feel if someone told them, you guys were anti-literature, you were anti-learning? How do you think it would make the university scholars feel, Christians, you don't like learning and you don't like the preservation of knowledge? How do you think that would make them feel? And I don't have time, I don't have time to tell you about Cyril of Alexandria, another Cyril, Cyril of Thessalonica. This is the guy who in the 9th century decided that it would be a really good idea to preserve the language and culture of the Slavonic people by creating an entire new writing system. You might have heard of it. It's called the Cyrillic script, and it's the main script used by the majority of people in Eastern Europe, and has been the centre point for why we even have their learning at all. I don't have time to even go through that. I could go on and on, believe me, and do entire history courses about history, how Christianity has been integral to the furtherance, propagation, protection of literature, science, and academic knowledge generally. But I'll stop there, because at the very least, I hope you can come out of here with a better understanding of the wider context of what happened to Hypatia, what happened to the Alexandrian Library, than you had when you came in here in the first place. So, thanks.
Right, well, anyway, thank you very much for your very passionate talk. Yeah, and there's a lot. I've never heard of Hypatia, so I learned quite a lot myself. Now, you mentioned that Christians were primarily responsible for preserving ancient writings, but didn't the Muslims also play a role?
Someone's going to ask me about that, yes. And I would say that, yeah. I tried to stress that in terms of within Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because that's true, because that's the areas that we were heavily involved in. But yeah, no, I definitely agree that Muslims were involved in that to some degree, in the areas that were run by Muslims. I'd add though that both of those are monotheistic Judeo, they're from Judeo backgrounds, and what that means is that both of us, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we come with a deep respect for the material world because we see God created it. And so part of the reason why, Muslims did actually care about a lot of that stuff and continue to some extent today is precisely because, in their case, Allah made all of this good stuff, so of course we should care about it. So it comes to a deeper accusation that religion discourages people from, preservation and learning and things like that. Well, that just doesn't stand up.
Yeah, but like, didn't the Renaissance actually spring out the rediscovery of a lot of the classical literature that had been pursued by Muslims?
Yeah, so there's two reasons why, there's two ways of approaching that. One is in Spain, there's the Reconquista during the 15th century, where Spain the Christian north reconquers the south and takes over the whole Iberian Peninsula. And when they did that, they found that there were all these yummy books in the mosques there and places like that the imams had left, and they took those straight into Italy and to France and places like that, and adamantly took them in. On the flip side, you've got the other side, coinciding that is the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims, and some of the monks who were living there didn't want to stay there, and so they actually ran to places like Vienna and things like that, and yeah, they ended up bringing a lot of their books with them as well. So yeah.
All right. And also, had there been much discourse in Spain between the Muslims during the Renaissance?
Between the Christians and the Muslims?
Yes, and the Jews in particular.
No, they were too busy killing each other. Like there is a little, but not as much as we'd probably like. The main place where that really kicks in is actually Sicily, in southern Italy. So the island of Sicily, for a long time, under a bunch of kings, King Roger, I think his name. They were all working very hard to have Christians, both actually Catholic and Orthodox Christians, Jews and Muslims all interacting, and that actually extended to academia. That's probably a more prevalent example of that cross-pollination taking place, although it does happen elsewhere as well. So yeah.
I'm curious about the numerical system. The Arabic system seems to be most given the most, approval or whatever. But I was wondering why the Arabic and not, Jewish system.
Okay, you're stretching me a bit in terms of, because my maths is terrible, man. But I will say on Netflix, there's actually a really interesting documentary series on the history of mathematics. And at a popular level, that's awesome fun. So first thing, I defer to that. But I will say the other thing about it is the Arabic system just works much neater for doing maths. So one of the things that you learn when you're looking at, say, Roman numerals and stuff, is it's hard to do complex mathematical equations within that kind of a framework, or the Jewish numbering system or those kind of things. The Arabic one it's just beautiful for doing complex mathematical equations.
They invented zero.
Yeah, that's the other.
That's the significant invention. There was a guy called Algorithm who algebra was named after, and he invented algebra.
I keep studying Islam intensely, so it's even though we call them Arabic numerals, they're actually Hindu.
Yeah.
So the Arabs, the Arab culture took credit for that.
Yeah, but they made the zero.
Okay, I'd want to check that out also, because I find that a lot of things got Arabized, or they say what I would say they're taking credit for other people's inventions.
So I'm not taking credit for it. I'm just saying they were the source of zero.
Yeah.
I was curious because
which is a fundamental thing for us to understand that there's something between 1 and minus 1.
Yeah, I just want to check if the Hindus worked it out before they did.
Yeah. That allowed them the invention of minus. The concept of decimals.
But that's nothing much.
That's nothing, no.
I want to say the Hindu civilization was doing wonderful mathematics and astronomy, and
they always so were the Muslims.
Yeah.
The first astronomers.
goat herders.
Sorry, just
we better get on back on the topic.
I know that Family Voice had a guy, and I'm trying to think, apologist from India, who
Vishal Mangalwadi.
Was that the guy who
Yeah.
asked himself why was it the West advanced so quickly? And I think he used the case of the wheelbarrow as one instance. In India, in Hinduism, if you're a lower caste, you're worthless. You don't get any help with anything. It's only when in a faith system we regard all men as being created by God that you actually provide tools that enable those who are less fortunate to do work. So and then there was the time. And he said, why is it that the clock was invented in a monastery? And again, again using Eastern religions, they have a concept of time of great meditation, but you don't worry about the time of the time slipping away. But in the Christian faith, and this is why was it the clock invented by the Christian people? Because we do have what's the right one? I'm trying to think the expression he used. We have to be accountable for our time. And that's not a concept that's that prevalent. It's not even a priority in the Eastern religions. It's something that is a priority because we have a creator to whom we're accountable to. And it was very interesting to hear because that was from his perspective, having come out of Hinduism and said, well, why did we advance in those ways? And that was his take. As an apologist now for the Christian, become a Christian, but that's why he gave those examples. The wheelbarrow and the clock were invented because we have a different worldview.
Anyway, back to Alexandria.
Sorry, yes, back to Alexandria.
Meanwhile, back to Alexandria. You mentioned Julius Caesar.
Yep.
And the burning down under Julius Caesar was not deliberate. It was
an accident.
Very tragic accident. And there was also another incident with Aurelian.
Yeah, I mean, there's a series of 4 or 5
and also sometimes the Muslims are accused of finishing it off.
Well, I'm not going to accuse them of that. It's not my place to say that.
But it, was it already gone by that stage?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we're talking about... Okay, let me put it in perspective.
Can you briefly describe each of them?
Each of the burns? No, I haven't really looked at that much detail. But effectively what I can tell you is, okay, Tabor's library is over there, right? Tabor's library has 40,000 books in the actual library. It has 200,000 books on digital library. Okay, and that's where a large proportion of universities are now going. They're putting more and more of their books digitally. Now imagine that one day our internet account completely went like a massive virus through it or something like that, and those 200,000 completely were obliterated. But that was okay because we managed to back some up and that kind of thing, and we still had like 100,000 of them. We managed to scrape back plus the 40. And then we kept on doing that over and over and over again. And then we got to the point where there's actually about 2 or 3 wings in that library. One of them got burnt out, but we managed to save 20,000 books. That kind of thing. And then some idiots went in there on a rage spree, ran in and destroyed all of the last 10,000 or 15,000 books that were there. That would be really bad of them. But to then go to them and say, you've totally destroyed the 240,000 books that were part of this library would be a touch much. And that's effectively what's happening in this.
Yeah, but, I think as a modern person, it's craving that continuity with the ancients that we lack, and they're seen as the last ones to destroy everything, or everything's good, okay, rather than even the fragments. So they're blamed because of that mold. And you haven't said how they actually formed the mold and why they did it.
Yeah, again,
I've read about it, but
because, part of the thing for me is, there were some really good books in there, and probably some books that were totally irreplaceable.
But I'm more coming at it not about the irreplaceability, but that link to the past.
That link, yeah.
That's what I'm getting at.
But
destroyed,
the point is that link is broken once a book that was like the last copy is gone. This is Sagan's point. Sagan's making a valid point if it's right. And the valid point is, imagine if all of the works apart from Winter's Tale and that kind of stuff were lost of Shakespeare. Right. That'd be a tragedy. And that's the kind of, that's where you're coming from here. The thing is that it was a tragedy in 40 BC when most of those were destroyed. But you can't blame anyone for that. You can't blame Christians, you can't blame anyone. It was just, an accident. But more than that, when you do get to the time where the Serapians actually burned, there may have been some books that were lost. But actually a large proportion of the books that were there were probably in libraries across the Roman Empire by that point, in Antioch and other places, because all of those were competing to have rival libraries to Alexandria. And they were doing that for political reasons, but on one level, who cares? Those books were all, not all, I don't know, I don't have a library catalogue, but a large proportion of the literature was that we're worrying about here were probably in monasteries, in libraries across the place, because that's what they were doing. They were propagating those books all over the place. Yep.
Yeah, but there's a slight contradiction with what you said towards your end of your talk there, between making that assumption and how long it takes to get a leather parchment actually prepared. So there's a.
I don't mean it I can see what you mean. Maybe that just requires me to clarify. What I'm saying is that we're talking about, by this point, Christian academia within the Roman Empire has been around for 200 years. And that 200 years has seen people trained at Alexandria, and also Origen actually ended up working in Antioch, mainly to stick it up the Bishop of Alexandria, it's a fun story, and working in an academic institution and monastery there. And other people were doing that. And other people, and Christians were running these kind of monasteries with libraries and academic institutions with libraries for at least 200 years before you get to here. So my point is, all of them are bringing books left, right and centre, sharing books and copying them out. That's part of what they do. So it's kind of a misnomer to say this is the one last vestige of the literature that we have from the ancient world. There may have been some books there that no one else had copied and taken to anywhere else. There may have been. But actually, a large proportion of literature was being shared and cross-pollinated by that point.
So that was my question.
Yep.
Are you assuming that there wasn't a lot lost because of, as you said, the expense and the difficulty with copying? And it was more. Is that something we know, or something we are arguing from silence?
No. I'm not saying that they didn't do the work because it was too expensive or anything like that. My point is that they did do the work and they didn't care about the expense because they saw it as so valuable. So my point in bringing up how hard it was to make a book was not to say that they didn't actually, do the work because it was just too expensive. My point was that they did actually invest incredible amounts of money and time and effort and things like that to make sure that these books were propagated like all over the place.
I fully understand the point.
Yep, okay.
I fully understand the point. I was just that the point about how difficult it was, how expensive it was, how committed you have to be, and even if they were committed, speaks against the
sense of it propagating all over the place.
The sense of it propagating all over, and we didn't lose much.
Except for one factor, and that is we're talking about a church that is financed by the Roman flipping Empire. And therefore they actually have a lot of money. What's fascinating is that we often, this comes to another discussion we could actually give up. One of those things that from an apologetics point of view is often stated is that once the church got money, they lost their soul and they started to do bad things with it. Right? That's a different talk for a different night. Well, one of the things that I can say is that, they got a lot of money and they did do some bad things and that kind of stuff. But one of the things that they spent an awful lot of money doing was preserving books. So you're right, at first it looks like Matt's saying that they propagated all of these books, but then he's also saying it cost too much to do that. Except I'm not saying too much. I'm saying it'd be too much for most people, but for a government, for monks that are getting a ton of money and who also don't like spending money on much else because they've got a vow of poverty and stuff, they've got nothing better to do with their time than sit around reading. which, and you might remember in the rule says, reading is good prayer. This thing, the whole thing of writing was actually was a spiritual discipline for them, and so they actually. I'm just rabbling now because it's a cool.
No. Reading is prayer.
Yeah.
I'm glad it came tonight.
Yeah. Right. So
Are you a bad prayer, eh?
Wouldn't most of those
I better read it.
copying of the Bible?
No.
But how can you say that?
I can guarantee you of that, because every book from the Western era, short of the Muslim ones, but the ones that are in like medieval libraries during that period, they didn't come out of nowhere. They had to be written down by someone within the last 100 to 200 years, because otherwise they would have been destroyed. So if there is any way that we have any of the ancient books that aren't Christian or that are or whatever, they had to have been done by monks.
Okay.
So my point is, like, you know, if you want to say, well, you know, how do I know that they were writing other books? Because there was no other way that those books would have been preserved at all, if not for that.
But what I'm trying to say is that a majority probably would have the Bible, and these were the more important ones would have been them on being the Bible. And also, I do believe I've read that a lot of them were translated into Latin, which were then translated into Arabic and made their way to the West via the Muslims.
Yeah.
Some of those ones.
No, you're right. Like,
And to the east.
And then when they found the Greek versions when the sack of Constantinople, they started and spot the differences, or slight differences anyway that you get.
Yep, so there's several points there. One is the point about were they mainly focusing on the Bible and more broadly just religious texts generally, like theological books by people? Yes, they were, but that's not all they were doing. They were very open because God's truth is all truth, and they weren't threatened by that. They were happy to use things on medicine and everything. Now, to be honest, the medicine that they were getting was pretty crappy. But that's not the discussion we're having. We're having the discussion of preserving historical texts, and that was very much a monastic thing. Now, you're right. There is this thing of what happened. Part of the reason why the Renaissance happens is because of a thing called ad fontes. Ad fontes is a Latin term, and the Latin term, and what it's a Latin term for, is back to the sources. So what happened was that, you're right, some of the literature had not been preserved within the Western thing. It had just got lost along the way. And that's when they did find Greek texts from the Greeks who were leaving Constantinople, and similarly the Muslim texts from Spain. They suddenly found all these amazing texts that they hadn't had access to for quite some time. And that was the main reason behind the humanistic renaissance of the late 1400s going into the 1500s, was because they went, hey, this isn't, we had that, we thought that Aristotle said that, but he actually says the complete opposite in that book. We haven't seen that book before. We need to get back to the sources to understand them. And you're right, in some cases they had been translated from Latin to Greek, Islam, to Arabic, left, right and centre. But it was in that process of getting those back. So it's not a linear story, but it is a story of the cross-pollination through war or academia of different cultures preserving texts. And the fact that they could preserve any of those texts during such a tumultuous period is pretty remarkable.
I got confused in part of your talk when you actually talked about the political environment surrounding the attack of the pagans and the death of Hypatia.
Yes.
So could you actually, you mentioned a few names very quickly, and can you clarify that, please?
Okay, so Cyril had just recently become, at the time, Cyril had recently become the bishop, or he'd replaced the previous bishop. And at the time, he was trying to vie for more political control over the city. Like I said, I'm not suggesting for a second that Cyril's not at all. He was very much doing that, and he saw in the power struggle of that, Orestes Orestes, O-R-E-S-T-E-S. Orestes to be a threat to that because he's the governor, right? And so
So he wanted to take over from the governor.
Yeah, or at least he wanted to make the governor his pet instead of the other way around.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Usually at this period, the church supports the state, right? The church, is an organ of the state in the Roman Empire. Cyril's not a big fan of being an organ of anything, and so he was vying for more control. Orestes, and this is where it gets a bit fuzzy. Part of the reason why I don't want to go into this too much is because the sources that we have are fairly sparse, but for whatever reason, Orestes seems to have either been influenced by Hypatia to shame in some way or humiliate Cyril, or at the very least she got blamed for Orestes humiliating Cyril, basically insulting him. And you got to understand it's an honour-shame culture, so there's that matters. And so whether she's directly involved or not, she is attributed to have done that. And there's all kinds of fun things like that. I want to stress as well, Cyril doesn't actually do the deed of killing her or anything like that. It's his posse, his mob, his supporters. And they do that because they feel that Orestes has insulted Cyril, and that's very bad. You shouldn't do that. And so to get back at him, they kill Hypatia. So then
Orestes wasn't killed.
No, Orestes wasn't killed. Now there's questions as to how much Cyril was directly involved in that process and how much, he endorsed them doing that, how much he egged them on, how much he actually commanded them to, and it depends on the sources that you read from the period. But again, I'm being really cautious about speaking about the specifics because we don't actually have that many sources to get into the details of that. Okay?
Why did Cyril want to be above the governor? Was it just a lust for power, or did he have some sort of higher motive for doing it?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I've got a book up in my thing. I was reading about it today. I can't speak about why specifically Cyril did it in this specific instance, wanted to be there, but I can tell you in the case of his arguments with Nestorius, he says, so I've got his works, and then I've got a work by a guy called Christopher Hall, who's a wonderful patristic scholar, and he quotes this bit by Cyril where Cyril says, I don't want to actually be above anyone. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't want to be above anyone. I'm just here to serve the Lord. And if other people want to do things that are contrary to his will, and that means that I have to stand up and be above them, well, I'll humbly do it, as I might. And Christopher Hall's response to that is, you can imagine every single person who knows Cyril just rolling their eyes when they read that. Okay? So, to your question of the motivations of Cyril, certainly in the Nestorius incident, he's telling himself and anyone else who will listen that he's just doing it because it's a dirty job but someone's got to do it. Right? Most people think he was a power-hungry megalomaniac. If that's what happens in his later career under Nestorius, it wouldn't be completely out of the realms of possibility to ascribe that similar kind of mentality to his relationship with Orestes.
Does that have a lesson for us today?
You think so? Yeah. Pride comes before a fall, and it's not a godly thing. And,
we're told to be wise as servants and harmless as doves, and not to be naive about what is going on.
Yeah.
So should we actually keep our eyes open as well for this sort of thing going on?
Yeah, but we also are taught to search ourselves and our own character, and to make sure that the reason why we do things isn't because of our own ego or our own
look at ourselves first.
Yeah, and many people have accused Cyril of losing sight of that in his career.
Get someone like William Wilberforce though put in a position because I guess his fact of which class he was in, he gets automatically elected to Parliament. What do? You're in a position of power.
Yep.
Should you use it for good? Well, he did.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, there's plenty. The thing is, my point in bringing that up about Cyril is to say I'm not a fanboy of him, and I recognise that he was not a great dude. But if you want to make the point that there have been great Christian men and women thrust into prominence who had to take responsibility for the good of others and wrestled with their ego in the midst of that, yeah, lots of times. Wilberforce is a good example, but you could go any number of other options.
Oliver Cromwell, perhaps.
With Cyril, it's really awkward because on one level, it's not my place to question the validity of the early church to ascribe someone sainthood. That's, on one level, that's rather... My Orthodox brothers and sisters would be rather cross at me doing that. But even saints can be sinners. So, yeah.
Like a fairly different question. When the library was destroyed at that time, was that all of the books then in the library that were destroyed, or just some?
That's a good question. And the reason it's a good question is because I don't entirely know the answer. There are accusations, as was said before, that later on the Muslims came in, when they came over and took over, that they destroyed the library further, which suggests, if that's true, and I'm not going to make that accusation, but if it is true, it would suggest that either the library had been somewhat replenished, which goes back to my point before of that, like there's books all over the place, and or that some areas had not been destroyed.
Like when the Serapeum was burnt, were the books a kind of collateral damage, or was the burning of the books deliberate?
You would have to ask those people in glory if they're there.
So we don't know.
It's hard to see. Certainly, their main motivation. Okay, the main motivation for the people going into the Serapeum in the first place was because they were pagan worshippers of Serapis, and so they went in there seeking haven. Eventually, they were forced, because they just had no way around it, they were forced to actually evacuate. And then the Christians went, you guys have been complete scumbags to us, we'll teach you a darn good lesson. And they destroyed their building. Now, how much of that is, and while we're here, those books are a representation of whatever, that's a matter for debate. I mean, part of what I was trying to say before is the prime reason for doing it was because they were in retaliation to the provocation of the pagans who got the fight going in the first place.
Were they a mob?
Yeah.
Basically, which is that's the danger I see. The lesson is more about we shouldn't support extremists or promote hatred of the other side.
Yeah, categorically.
Because that would have been what they were stirred up by, in my feeling, that the hatred of the other mob, or the fear or whatever it was. It wasn't, a mob doesn't react to logic you talked about, they're just stirred up.
Yeah, of course.
All you need is a handful of people, and they can do a lot of damage and destroy lives.
They killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
Those guys didn't get out, from my read. There were no survivors.
I'm wondering about the background of... Sorry, I thought you'd finished. I'm wondering about the background of the lady called Hypatia, because I don't know anything about her. Now, way back, I don't know too much about Greek culture, but I could be in the wrong century, you see.
Yep.
There used to be a class of ladies called hetairai who were capable of having sensible and scholastic conversations with gentlemen. I don't know what other services were involved, so I don't know if they were prostitutes. They were sometimes described as courtesans. But was she from that sort of class, or how did she escape being married and having a tribe of kids?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's not because she was part of that class. It's because one reason is because her dad was a gun professor, right? So her dad was a gun professor, and she had shown a proficiency from a very early age that I'm really smart, and you should, and you know, and her dad would like propagate that and encourage that, and say, you know, like he'd have her in classes and he'd say, you know, well, that's a great question. Hypatia, what do you think about that? That kind of thing. And then she grew a reputation herself. That seems to be the kind of key narrative to it. She had a really awesome dad.
Were there other ladies who had the similar sort of trajectory to life that she did?
Not many, certainly not many. Hypatia's pretty remarkable.
Wow, thank you.
I mean, like, on this level, Sagan's right. Like, it's a patriarchal society, you know, and Rome was a patriarchal society long before Christians got there. So, like, you know, there aren't a lot of women doing a lot of stuff. But I will show you, just if I just get back. Sorry, man. Right. I want to show you that picture. So that's the preserving literature picture. And what I want you to notice, right, so that is a scriptorium. Now, a scriptorium isn't where they read the scriptures. It comes from the Latin idea of book, and it's where they all sat around and wrote books, like copied out books over and over and over again. And one of the things I want you to notice is there's two guys there, and there is a nun. Right? So a little sub-story with this, and because it's not a big deal in the Sagan narrative, but there is this kind of subtext of, you know, if we were going to have gender equality, we needed Christianity to get out of the way. Well, the amount of Hypatias there's not many. But there are an astonishing array of nuns who do some pretty cool stuff. You know, Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, Catherine of Genoa, Julian of Norwich, and I could go on.
Well, they're just the famous ones.
And they're just the famous ones. They're not the ones that are like just sitting quietly somewhere, writing out books, having an influence in their society. And I mean, that's a co-ed scriptorium. You know, so actually, in terms of the pursuit of learning and women being able to participate in that, Christianity has been pretty supportive of that on a whole host of levels, basically because of monasticism. So,
because most of this occurred pre the Reformation, like we're mostly Protestants, and so we jump straight from the early church to Martin Luther, don't we? And we forget all the stuff that happened in between. So. Is this kind of a weakness in Protestantism that we've neglected?
Protestantism and the printing press seem to come pretty close together.
Categorically. This is, and this in my lectures, I make this point repeatedly. So, like in my first week of my Story of the Church class, my introductory church history class, what I do is I get the whiteboard. And I write a timeline, and I say to them this is the last 15 minutes of the class, just tell me every single thing as an entire class that you know about church history, right? I don't even need you to know when it happened. I'll fill in the blanks as to when it happened. You tell me anything, any person, any event, anything that you know. I give 15 minutes for that exercise. It gets done in 5. Because most of the time, they don't know anything. And, like, it's just astonishing. And that is, like, that's not an indictment on my students.
It's terrible with kids these days, isn't it?
And there's older people in there too. That's not an indictment on my class students. It's the systemic culture that we live in that is antagonistic to the study of history anyway, but in our churches, and our Protestant churches, absolutely. But one of the things that I've seen again and again and again and again and again is that what they do fill out is really strong in the Reformation not too bad in the modern, okay-ish in the early, and there is this massive gap of 900 years where there are two things every single year: Crusades and Inquisition. That's it. At a stretch, I might occasionally, just to make my heart sing, have Francis of Assisi chucked in. And that's because of a misquote that they've heard about Francis of Assisi and preaching without words, which means that it's wrong anyway. My point is, for 900 years of their history, the most they can tell me is about two events and one guy that they misquote. And the two events are times where the reason they know about those is because people have told them that Christians suck because of those two things. And that's it. For 900 years of our history. So this stuff, you're right, Kevin. We don't know it.
All right, we'll try and